welcome to part 2. Those of you who are still interested in the series, I hope you've enjoyed thus far. We're moving on to the world section now, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. Obviously, if this is a one-time watch, I don't expect a sub, but if you'd be interested in seeing some similar content from me in the future, I'd highly recommend that you do. I plan to release more long-form content in the coming months because... what else am I going to do? Anyway, enough begging, let's get right into it. So firstly, what do I mean by world? In a broad sense, it's anything the environment tells us about the fictional universe we're inhabiting, as well as the characters. Also, they're given rules we are to learn over the course of the game, and when those rules are broken. Any limitations in the game with regard to exploration or movement will also be discussed. Now we're all on the same page about what I mean, why don't the rats consume the bodies of the corpses in the battlefield? Have they received sustenance, and that's why they're not eating them? No. Most chances they get to eat us when we're not in the light, they attack us. But we'll get back to this. Why is it that on occasion we're able to arm ourselves, having been captured, we're unable to? You could argue that the character is not trained or proficient in the use of either a bow, crossbow, or any other melee weapon. But surely it's better than nothing. You could also argue that this is a stealth section, so that wouldn't suit the approach, but still. If you're caught off guard, you'd rather have a weapon, no? Also, we're somewhat led to believe that the main character may have some proficiency in weapons like a crossbow or regular bow, presumably of a lower poundage. Since in the very opening of the game we are given a tutorial which involves hunting, where we learn the basic sling mechanic. Maybe there could have been more of an explanation there. Like she tries to use the bow but can't quite pull it back far enough. And then you are presented with a sling. Or just don't have weapons lying around that you in real life would pick up and try to use, should the need arise. Aside from rules, I wanted to discuss world building, or things we are told passively. And what I mean by that is stuff that we notice by exploring or things taking a back seat to the main story. What we can learn or interpret from the world around us. Before we get into that, I'm no expert, but to my knowledge a thatched roof has to be a bit steeper than that to make the rain glide off it better, although it seems to be of sufficient thickness. Like I could be completely wrong, but to my knowledge they are supposed to be like super thick and super steep. And it's been one of those things that, you know, historians have kind of complained about with a lot of set dressing and locations for these historical settings. We have an option to pay respects to Doggo at the altar.
Take care of Leon, please. He deserves his place at your side, even if he was a bit naughty sometimes. Goodbye, my darling dog.
Which is wholesome and further establishes that Leon was considered part of the family, and his loss is very impactful. Also, her mentioning that he was naughty sometimes kind of checked me up a bit, not gonna lie. I think it also, at least in part, represents the beginning of a loss of innocence. Most family households will deal with the loss of a pet, often punctuated with the tarnishing of a nostalgic memory. When Amicia thinks of that day in the woods with her father, the focus won't be on the fun they had, or the excitement of the chase. It will be of the death and horror. It also sets up some of the more religious significance of the time period, and later parts of the game where you pray or are confronting / coming to terms with the concept of mortality. The leaves falling down is nice, in addition to the textures on the floor, giving the impression that the sun is fading and we may in fact be in autumn. Obviously it says so in the opening, November 1348, but it's nice to have a visual way of communicating this. Although for this guy to outright say,
"This sunshine won't last long. The rain has already ruined the harvest. People are dying of hunger,"
it is a little unnecessary. Although it is a suitable indication of darker days to come, which is reflected in the shift of seasons. We have trying times ahead which occur as we approach the winter months. This is reflected at the end of the game when it treats us to a crisp February morning with the promise of spring just around the corner. We have a nice interaction with Gabrielle, letting us know that the simple folk have a good relationship with their lords and ladies. Theo, another worker, reinforcing this, has placed pots around the back of the stables for you to practice on, serving as a reminder of the connection this character has with its community, and a way for us to gain more competence with the sling mechanic. Something similar occurs as we enter the main house. If you enter Amicia's room, aside from seeing Leon's bed and reflecting upon his death, and how he represented an escape for her to occupy her time, we see that one of the servants, Louise, has left something on her bed, more specifically a placemat, which Beatrice made for Amicia when she was little, something which until recently found by a servant was lost. The smaller details are what make the characters that we shouldn't really care that much about slightly more humanised, since they are people we directly interact with and have done favours for or provided a service for us. Which doesn't end there. They were all slaughtered not long after, in some instances as a direct result of attempting to save us from the Inquisition.
Hugo, it's me, Gabrielle. Come here, quickly.
Hey, you! What the hell are you doing?
Let's go.
That's the kid, huh?
Leave him alone.
Shut your mouth! He belongs to the Inquisition.
But he's just a child. You've lost your mind.
Gabrielle.
And knowing this beforehand makes the prior exchange all the more sombre. During this opening segment we also have a mention of Hugo's, at this point, unknown condition.
Ah, Gabrielle. Is mother upstairs?
Yes, she spent the night there. The little one had another one of his attacks.
By unknown, I mean to us, the character. Entering the main house, we notice that we can still see the man simply known as Servant working from inside. It's all one environment, separated by a short animation. By seeing a representation of the area we were just in but no longer have access to, brings everything together, and you don't feel like you're separated from it by a loading screen. Not that that would be a bad thing necessarily. Nonetheless, I appreciate the effort to make it more seamless. Having said that, this doesn't seem to extend beyond that. If we make our way towards the pantry and kitchen, which we will later escape from, we see a simple 2D texture just outside the window to the environment which we will be entering soon. Again, massive nitpick, but it seems like what I mentioned before is a massive illusion. It isn't all one pre-rendered environment as it might like you to think. There are seeds planted for the village to come in the following chapter. Unless it wasn't made clear, they express concern that the rats only attack at night.
Did you hear what happened at the village?
People being bitten. Kids too, can you imagine?
Each time it happens at night?
Famine, war on our doorstep.
Assumed to be vampires due to simply bites being noticed.
Oh, we must have sinned something rotten to be punished so.
Also showing that in this time, anything bad happening will be attributed to sins. There's going to be a separate section on the AI, but look at this. The servant just kind of ignores me and then acts as if I warped into existence. Oh, I didn't see you there. It's like, mate, I'm right here. It's obviously just a case of the NPC characters needing to finish their conversation and have a cooldown period, and you should ideally be able to hear what they're saying in full, as opposed to being interrupted by your entry. But maybe they could have their standard dialogue when you're in their proximity, and then at some point in between the lines there's a pause, acknowledgement of you,
Lady Amicia, hello.
then continuing with the conversation. If you want to explore a little bit, we have some wholesome comments about cinnamon, and how her father used to put it in every dish, resulting in it being hidden. At this point, assuming you've played the game before, you realise that the reason for establishing a good relationship with the servants, and giving them personality traits, or likes, such as the cinnamon, is to make them likeable so the shock value is more profound when they are inevitably slaughtered, since you saw them as individuals, rather than a bunch of ones and zeros. This is reasonably subtle and it relies on your exploration and interaction, rather than just a cutscene with exposition, although there is exactly that at times. Scratch marks and dents in the armour give it some history in the sense that these were obviously sustained during a battle we were not present for. I think it's also a deep contrast to how you see heavy armour, or general armour later in the game. Here it is an innocent piece of set design, with a potential rich history, however it comes to represent fear and death as you encounter heavily armoured inquisitors later. Might seem like I'm reaching, but a little later you watch a servant slaughtered right next to the armour display. It's just short of a close-up shot with blood being splattered over it. We later witness the exchange between Lucas and Amicia. When we visit the house later, we can collect the helm of Robert next to the very same armour set, presumably one that goes with it. Also, during this part of the game in Chapter 12, when revisiting the Darun estate, we see the entirety of the grounds overtaken by the rats and their nesting. On our approach, it appears that the servants have been spared, being left alone and not consumed. This is carried through into the entrance of the main house in the early game. Based on the camera positioning, it seems to bring focus to it. The other symbols have been engulfed, swallowed or otherwise desecrated, with the one large Darun coat of arms left virtually untouched. I imagine this was an intentional choice, perhaps representing the seed of hope for their family's return, or maybe Hugo subconsciously enacting his desire to preserve that which he loves. This would somewhat make sense given that his room is one of the only places left untouched, as well as several flowers placed around the world in places completely overrun, but intact. Although there isn't much else that would make me believe that, my own interpretation of this is that since it has not been made clear to him at this point exactly what it is he has been able to subconsciously express a desire for those few things to be preserved, since they are a representation of his childhood, and therefore safety, happiness, etc.
The little one loves flowers. I used to take him some.
Flowers? You can do better than that. Take him.
And the reason for not being able to control the rats until much later in the game is he doesn't know. However, even if you're willing to go along with that, it doesn't explain why he can die from the rats, or those around him that he cares for. Wouldn't he want them to, leave him alone? I don't get it. We see him later in the game exert complete control over every single rat, making sure they can distinguish between friend and foe. This is something Joseph Anderson mentioned, so that's all I'll say on it. The architecture and set design is convincing in the great dining halls and entrance room, with decorated trinkets, bookshelves and food. Whereas the areas in between and near the stairs are a little bare, since obviously you wouldn't be prioritising those spaces as much. We go upstairs, discuss Hugo and his condition, and we establish that we don't know him that well. Many books scattered around, not only in the main study area, but also in Hugo's room, of a much larger capacity than expected for a child's mind or attention span, leading us to believe that a lot of the time and resources have been spent trying to cure him of his affliction. It could also imply that since Hugo has had a reasonably sheltered life thus far, focus has been put on indoor play, represented by his den or whatever, and the presence of books, which might imply he spends more time with them, and thus required more material than that of the average children's book. We're introduced to Hugo, and in doing so further establish the relationship between the siblings, that being one of separation and not being particularly close, since there has to be some kind of formal introduction. Lord Nicholas and his men arrive, infiltrate the castle. We overhear dialogue from the enemy NPCs where they are interrogating the servants, asking where they can find Hugo. At this point we're unsure why exactly he is wanted. We make our way through the set piece, move outside into the garden, and we passively learn something about the characters, while also reinforcing the idea that there was a good relationship between the royalty and the servants. A gardener, Theo, from earlier, says the little one loves flowers, which sets up the flowers as a collectible item and temporary cosmetic, allowing us to have some wholesome moments too. There's some more sneaky parts. We're introduced to a few gameplay mechanics, those being able to throw things to distract guards, helping Hugo get over walls, telling allies to stay and then come back to you, some more killing and violence, and we flee. As the enemies have been alerted to our presence, we are hunted. As this happens, we hear rumbles in the ground as spears and torches surround us. But seriously, how easy would it be to accidentally hit Hugo with one of those spears? It's a very delicate matter they're dealing with. You could make the argument that, these soldiers are supposed to be a bit incompetent, and seeing a spear being launched at you would induce a degree of urgency, which is obviously something the game is trying to convey. But it doesn't make sense from a narrative perspective, especially when you're captured at the end of Chapter 5 as the result of a ransom being put on you. Why not just kill us and keep Hugo around? Pretty sure Amicia doesn't accurately fit the description of a 5-year-old boy. Anyway, we are forced into the river. After washing up on shore, it's a morning and it's sunny. As we emerge, we can see Amicia's bun has become unravelled, which is a rather fitting time for this to happen, considering both parents are now dead. Her land, home and title have been taken away from her, and by extension, her identity, and it signifies that things are now different for her. Also, the fact that she is thrust into a body of water and emerges differently kind of solidifies this drastic change. We are left to assume that this is either the following day, or the weather has drastically improved, and is no longer dark for some reason. Amicia doesn't seem bothered about helping Hugo at this point, allowing for character development over time. Hugo is left alone to pull himself out of the water. At this point, she doesn't seem to understand the huge responsibility his care implies. We proceed to the village entrance. Hugo inspects the apples as he's hungry, but they're rotten, which was mentioned previously by the servants in conversation. As you inspect the textures of the food, accompanied by the sounds of the surrounding flies, you see it is almost a representation of the beautiful and sheltered world we are leaving, and the gradually more disgusting, morally corrupted version we are entering, as we stand just outside the plague-infested village. There is smoke emanating from what appears to be a more central part of the settlement, with no one visible among the streets. As we progress through the village, 2 women promptly disperse and retreat to their homes, without saying a word. Something nice is Hugo taking a little initiative. Once you knock on the second door, he branches off to knock on another. However, there is no response.
I'm with my little brother. The de Rune estate was attacked. I'm begging you, please help us.
After carrying on through the village, another woman from above shouts down. Clearly we are very unwelcome, in case it wasn't already made clear. Hugo runs off to inspect the crosses on the door, once again indicating to us that he is unaware of all the current dangers posed to him, and we are responsible for him entirely. Some foreshadowing here for the end of the game. Hugo thinks that the smoke is an indicator of a fair, obviously naively so. We are abruptly treated to the first of many gory sights, along with the focus pull and pan to the right, allowing us to understand the brutality of the people of the village, along with the fate of the woman still remaining. We've set up things for now, I think. I don't want to go through the whole story because there will be an odd remark covering those type of world-building aspects, so we can tackle those parts separately. Something else I wanted to briefly mention here, before we move on, is the resources you have, and how they appear. I honestly think it could have been improved by simply having a small pile of rocks rather than a collection of them in a bag, just in the middle of the woods. Like sometimes they'll have pieces of leather in areas where it's more feasible for them to be, like a workstation or something, but you'll have these things popping up everywhere. And I know it's obviously just a way to drip feed resources to make sure the player is well stocked. I just find it weird to find some random objects in places I wouldn't expect. Also, I'm pretty sure you don't see anyone else with a sling. I'm fairly confident that slings were pretty common back then. I mean, obviously it was more of kind of a backup secondary weapon, you know, you'd carry one on your side or in your hat or whatever, but I don't know, it was just kind of weird that every single one of them had, you know, a bow or a sword. It just felt like they didn't have that much time to kind of expand on the number of enemies you could have. It's like, okay, you've either got a sword, you're heavily armoured, or you've got a bow and arrow, and that's fucking it. Obviously there are some that have spears that they can throw at you, but I don't know, it just feels like maybe it would have been interesting if after they run out of ammo, then they switch over to a sling, and that explains why there's loads of rocks everywhere. Right, on to guidance. Sometimes the game requires you to go forward in a certain manner, and enemy placements as well as your underlying aim, that being not to die, will sort of coerce you in a specific direction, although usually there is only one specific route you can take. For example, in the opening, when the threat and villain is first introduced, you have to go through this series of rooms to make this series of events take place, since going through any of the other doors would complicate and challenge the design set piece to follow. We soon realise that because the game needs strong control over player movement, there are scripted set pieces that we witness, which simply wouldn't work were we able to move around freely, since enemies would easily spot us. While we're on that topic, the scripted moments in the AI really stand out to me. That might be because I'm actively focusing on them. If you're a passive player, you might not. I'll have a dedicated section of this to the AI, but the first guy will literally search this little den forever. You can even get right next to him and he won't spot us because his protocol is solely focused on carrying out this requirement in the moment. Obviously, if you walk right up to him, he will kill you. Same can be said for later. They spend a lot of time fussing around the corpse once they've been killed. Like seriously, there's one instance where the guard is beating up someone and says something like, "Hey, where's the boy?" while gesturing and kicking them. Now for the instance where you're supposed to walk past with haste, this works. But if you just stand there, he continues to beat her indefinitely, all the while gesturing but not actually saying anything. I imagine because recycling a small amount of lines is a little awkward in this moment. It's a shame because we could have had something play out and they could go about their business, looking through drawers or simply walking out of the set piece. Instead, we get this slightly awkward moment with them, and you literally can't be caught by him. They put up an invisible wall to prevent you getting any closer. I'm assuming they didn't expect anyone to try this, and it would mean they would have to have him set to neutral stance, followed by spotting us, then killing us. That's a lot of effort in animation. He also serves as a way of forcing us down the stairs since there is nowhere else to go. So a bit of a tangent, but it was something I wanted to mention. There are a couple of times where the guidance is a little on the nose. Like it's not that bad as it kind of seems to establish itself as the type of game that will have an objective on screen but won't always tell you exactly how to do something. There will be button prompts etc, but nothing pointing to where you need to go exactly. But something I noticed once you enter the old woman's house after her initial offer to clothe you, if you decide to wander around, she will prompt you with her.
Now, be my guest. The chest is upstairs.
Just in case you didn't hear her the first time. It's almost as if the game is saying, come on now, let's get on with it. However, she only says this once, which feels more natural than her repeating 2 variations of the same line over and over again. Sometimes the game just wants you to do things in a certain order and doesn't account for you doing anything else. When you approach Hugo's cage on subsequent playthroughs, you might want to go straight to the chest where your equipment is being held. But you'll be surprised to see that the chest just doesn't want to open. The chest that looks identical to the ones we've been able to open previously. You have to go to Hugo, ask where the chest is, then you can get the equipment.
Get me out, please.
We have to get that cage down. It's all right, Hugo. Listen, my sling. Did they have it when they locked you up?
Yes, they put it in the trunk, there.
Right. Melly, can you look after it?
I want a team on the east ramparts.
Finally. Now, Hugo, I need to get the cage down.
It just doesn't really make sense to limit the player in this way. You could argue that it's not the priority in that moment, but you're able to pick up other surrounding items from other chests. Just not items in this chest, unless approved so by the game's script. And the contents of this chest is what ultimately allows you to free Hugo. So we obviously did the world section, but I wanted to talk about, more specifically, the actual guidance of the world and how it guides the player. So we obviously have a specific goal in mind that we need to get to before a cutscene breaks it apart or we move to a new area. There are a couple of instances in which the game does allow you to deviate, but it will always lead to the same place. This is a representation of one of the stealth set pieces you're going to be going through in the game. Now the game needs us over here. We're boxed in by cobbled walls and a body of water over to the top left. We end up in the same spot, which is over here, despite the game giving you some semblance of freedom. Although most would argue that going around this way to the left would be less encouraged, given the number of guards and it seeming to be a much tougher and longer way around. And it isn't directly in front of us once you emerge from here. This sort of represents the entire game in a way. You're given some leeway with how you get somewhere, but for the most part, given that it's a very linear, story-driven experience, you end up in the same place. And it normally comes around organically, since, as I said before, you're told what to do via your objectives on screen, but not explicitly told how. So its limitations do lend themselves to naturally guiding you in an effective manner, and it doesn't cause any major compromises to the experience. So mechanics and puzzles are put together as they are the bulk of what you'll be doing or engaging with during your time with the game. Most reviews or critiques might use the heading gameplay or something along those lines, but I wanted this section just to sum up pretty much everything you're going to be doing over the course of the game besides exploration, and the parts in between the more significant set pieces. So now I've said that, we can get into it. So there's going to be a couple of mentions of different mechanics or things you use, but I want to quickly go over everything, their use, how they could be improved, if applicable, and I've already spent so much time on it. Let's go! Rock. Pretty straightforward, it's a rock, you can fling it at people. Luminoso. It creates a combustion. You can burn most rats if they're clumped together. It's also kind of a last chance kind of thing if you get swarmed. Somnum. That's something that can incapacitate enemies from behind if you sneak up on them. This too acts as kind of a last chance if you become face to face with an enemy. But it takes a lot of materials to craft and you can only carry a limited amount. Extinguish. It puts out fires. Ignifer. Creates fire, but only upon embers or something obviously flammable. Odorous. Draws surrounding rats to a specific place. Devorantis. Firing this at an enemy's head forces them to remove their helm, leaving them exposed to a headshot from your sling. Pot. You can collect pots which can be thrown as a distraction to lure guards away to allow you to sneak past. Imperium. Essentially meaning absolute power, granting you the ability to control rats. Also arguably making the Odorous redundant, although the Odorous does seem to be faster acting than Hugo using his powers. Okay, we're all good, fantastic. The main mechanics are pretty straightforward. Your primary weapon is a sling, which in the beginning of the game can only shoot plain rocks, being presented as less of a lethal weapon and more of a tool in puzzle solving and avoiding enemies. Thankfully it is applicable in various circumstances. Most of the people I've heard talk about the use of the sling, or lack thereof, They mention the fact that you can approach certain segments in a more lethal manner, or a more evasive, in which you only use your sling to perhaps distract guards, or exclusively take out guards who absolutely have to. Now, this might sound contradictory to my previous comments about the game wanting you to play a certain way, but I meant it more in the sense of unnecessary limitations for set pieces. Just trust me, I have a more specific example later on in the sound section, if you can believe it. So just wait for that, because it's more in relation to that kind of stuff. The Sling's integration into the game is fairly well flowing. What I mean by that is it gradually evolves with your ability and competence as the player. You're introduced to it via Apple Tree, where you're aiming to knock apples from their place as a challenge. You are then required to use your sling as a hunting tool, and informed that you must hit them in the head. This naturally extends to human prey. However, this isn't something that occurs until a very specific moment. I attempted to use the sling against an enemy in the initial sneaky mission, where you're looking for an exit, but the game simply won't let you. This is obviously because they want to save this moment for a stronger effect. It also makes more sense narratively, since Amicia only uses the sling lethally to take out an enemy when she absolutely has to, or so it would seem. Also, point here, I decided I didn't really want to kill him, so I tried to evade him, but the game was like, nah mate, I'm just going to slow you down so that you have to, and if you don't, you're just going to die. And by the way, this isn't me having a go, I'm just saying that this is the way it is. You literally have to kill him. The game makes it fairly easy to deal with enemies not wearing a helmet. One shot kill, and it locks on instantly. There is a small wind up where the cursor gets itself into place and bosh! You can alter this in the settings to create more of a challenge for yourself, but at standard settings it's really difficult to aim effectively, since by definition of lock on you hardly even have to aim. You just need to be looking in the general direction. I say rarely. There are a few instances where if they're up close and moving very fast, it can sometimes be very difficult, simply because the cursor can't move that fast into place, and can hover in and out of lock-on, sometimes resulting in you missing. The times it gets kinda hard is when multiple enemies are coming at you all at once. You can dodge attacks to a certain extent by pressing circle, or whatever respective button you have, but it has a short cooldown period, so if you're near another hostile enemy, they will be able to get the jump on you. When you master all the mechanics, it can become quite satisfying to pull off. Let's say you have two enemies with helmets you want to take out. You would use the Devil Rantis on one, while he's flailing around you would hit the other with the same substance, by which point the first is vulnerable, you hit his head, then the same with the other. You can also use distraction techniques, whether this is more aggressive or passive. Aggressive would be using the Devil Rantis to hit an enemy in the head, then once he's distracted, run off and hide, and a passive method will be using throwable pots, which prompts them to go and investigate. You'll encounter a small variety of enemies, which you will deal with in the appropriate manner, or sometimes not at all if possible and desired. In Chapter 5, after Lucas joins the gang, we follow along the aqueduct and come across the battlefield. Here, we're required to deal with a few heavy enemies, brandishing full plate armour, and they also have lanterns to protect them from the rats, which cover a large portion of the area. Bear in mind that at this point in the story we don't have the Devil Rantis. The game leaves us no choice but to do this to the poor chap, setting up the dilemma later on, where we must choose whether or not to use our torch to get through, forcing the rats to the opposite end where there is a stranger enemy with no light source. You can, however, use the sconce just to the left to hold the torch for a moment. Then using your sling and the ignifer, you can provide a light source for the soldier. This criticism extends to the rest of the game, but it's kind of stupid that whether or not this man lives and the supposedly dramatic moment they were about to witness is hinged solely on the fact that Lucas can't hold a torch for 2 seconds. You have to be the one that holds the torch at all times, meaning that when you need to use the sconce to get over a wall or something, you lose that torch. It's gone. You gotta find another one. If anyone says Lucas can't hold it, I'll come round your house and I'll force feed you dirty socks. He pushes a cart with a giant brazier all by himself, and he's more than competent enough to lead the way and complete tasks.
We have to keep moving.
The fucking baguette-eating dickhead frog!
I mention this because I do have a suggestion for how it could be improved. If allies could hold the torch and take a more active role in that sense, it would make puzzles and solving problems more engaging. We get a peek of that in the actual game. You were able to send Hugo through holes to get sticks for you, and like I said earlier in the game, he goes to grab a torch. Then you have to follow him on the other side of the bars, staying in the light. Even though this is a very scripted moment, it could have been integrated more in the sense that you might need to do something, so you hand the torch to Hugo to keep him protected. This would also further cement the idea that he is yours to protect. You know, you're doing what's necessary, instead of him wetting himself when you leave his line of sight. There are a few instances where you leave him alone, for example, when you arrive at the chateau, and when you leave with other characters a couple times to complete missions. It would have been nice to see him develop a sense of confidence in-game. With regard to large puzzles, it's very much point here, press button, person does thing. I might not be the best person to ask about this objectively since I've played this game so many times, but the puzzles aren't really engaging to me. That is completely an opinion though. Objectively, they are very similar and simple. The chateau and the puzzle to reach the book require you to go to a place, pull a switch, letting your ally get to the other switch, meaning you can let go of your switch and so on. And that extends to combat. When you have Roderick as an ally, you have to make sure the enemy is facing the other way, which they often are anyway by design. Press a button prompt and Roderick takes care of it. You see a locked door or chest, press a button and melee opens it. I might be being a bit unfair to the game at this point, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there are a couple of examples I can think of which have puzzles act as a more engaging gameplay mechanic, which arguably could be applied in the context of this game. And it isn't a target audience thing either. There are a couple of games, for example the first Prince of Persia in the Sands of Time trilogy. That game is for 12+. Now obviously again we have the same problem here in assessing it, in the sense that I have played the game so many times that I know exactly how to do all these puzzles, but even so it is more involved in that you have to make decisions about how you do things, sometimes requiring you to do some platforming, etc. Obviously Amicia isn't an acrobatic, gravity-defying freak, but there are a few instances where you need to get over walls or whatever, but it isn't something you need to think about. There's no, timing the jump just right or anything like that. You press a button to ascend or just walk off to descend down. Something like Uncharted or Tomb Raider is also commendable in this instance. You have to find certain items, put them in the right place and figure out where you need to be. And they're pretty great, opinion again, but I think I've spoken some objective truths. There's obviously exceptions to the examples I've made in Plague Tale. When you're trying to get the book, you will need to find something to climb onto, but it doesn't really go much deeper than that. You've got the Roman ruins, and all you have to do there is light the necessary wood piles. But maybe that's not fair. Let's take a few examples which are closer in gameplay design or theme. The Last of Us is definitely one to draw from. I'm currently working my way through the second one, but there's a few examples of optional objectives or things to collect. Like you'll have this, kind of open-ish world section, where you can find a key with a name of a company or something on it. You would then mark it up, look at your map, figure out where you need to go, and voila. There's another example where you need to power a generator, but there isn't a cable nearby, so your only option is to grab one which has already served its purpose, throw it over and take it to the desired location. This is obviously quite simplistic and you get some heavy assistance from character dialogue, but you get my point. If this were a Plague Tale sequence, you'd need to pull a switch which would let Dina through the gate. While holding it via another button prompt, you'd send her over to the other switch, which would open the door trapping you, at which point you could let go of your switch and reconvene. What about God of War? I'm not sure what else I need to say aside from showing gameplay. You're often required to stand back and think about what you're doing, whereas in Plague Tale you can, in most cases, just kind of jump in and you'll figure it out pretty quickly. Again, this might be a bit unfair, especially considering the fact that this is a smaller company that made Plague Tale. I'm just trying to be objective. You could also make the argument that the example I gave for The Last of Us has modern technology integrated, or at least, remnants of it, facilitating more complex puzzles. God of War has magic and is entirely myth-based, rather than drawing from history. And we already discussed the limitations with the Prince of Persia comparison.
You know I can't climb like you can.
I would like to give a few personal suggestions for how more captivating puzzles might be implemented, which also fit within the context of the world. Let's say you find a scroll in the de Rune house. You find the laboratory equipment that you need and so on. Then you come across the scroll which has information pertaining to Hugo's condition. You'd have to decode it, maybe you could get some dialogue assistance if you're struggling a little bit. Lucas would then jump in being like, oh obviously, of course, which would explain him coming to the conclusion that the book was at the university library. I've switched up the chronology of events in this instance, but something like this facilitates more of a challenge, but also fits within the world. Obviously you would need to have a narrative explanation for why is the scroll here, whose is it, where did it come from, what purpose was it made for. This is probably the point where most people who enjoyed the game will be rather upset or angry with me, but just hold on a sec because I want to defend the game a little bit here. In the shadow of the ramparts, you need to get around some rats to get to the university where the book is. This involves the use of a light source and the odorous. You are to use the light source to trap them. You can then use the luminoso to destroy them. Just watching this puzzle play out, even though it is still pretty straightforward, it would have been nice to see more of this rather than this. This section has been rather opinionated. I respect that some won't agree with me, but I like to think I haven't been dishonest or misleading in any way. Right folks, now we're going to talk about lighting, graphics and the environment. In this section I'm talking essentially about how the game looks in general, and how this can affect the player and the experience. There is a separate section on atmosphere, so some of the gushing you're about to hear will be saved for that. To sum up, this game generally looks great. I was overall pleased with, for example, the reflections in metals, like this armour set. The reflections in the water were about as realistic as we can be right now, when we consider technical limitations. And what I mean by that is I'm not sure how I would make it better, even if I could graphically. The textures are serviceable in some areas, like walls or door hinges that the game assumes you will only see from afar, if at all. But then the big roaring fire moving and flickering in what would be a somewhat realistic fashion, accompanied by the warm lighting behaving accordingly, can create a cosy and welcoming environment, or a sinister and oppressive one when in a dungeon or underground. Upon closer inspection, you can see that the way they have achieved this is seemingly by having multiple 2D textures facing in different directions, giving the illusion of a realistic fireplace. But standing a few feet away, it looks very convincing, especially when you consider that fire is often something a little off in video games. Some of the detail is very extensive. I specifically noticed the wood shavings and chunks littering the ground surrounding this lumber in Chapter 6. I'm sure there were repeated assets of wood clippings, but they are placed in such a way that you would believe they landed there naturally. Coupled with the more unique segments of wood and you have a very convincing texture. If you look closer at the cut down trees, there's a little diversity in the textures of the outside and inside of the tree. There seems to be a repeat of about 3 types, but the way in which they're laid out, upon first glance, you can't really tell. The patterning on the inside of the trees is also very convincing as a texture, while also being an indication of different species and age. Something else noteworthy about the trees, they're actually jagged in places and some come to more of a point, forming a cone or raised middle, giving the impression that they were cut by hand with an axe as opposed to the use of more modern techniques. Small thing, but I thought it was worth mentioning. As you progress along the production line, you see lengths of lumber, most of which has had the bark removed and been cut according to its desired purpose. Again, there is probably repeated assets, but you wouldn't really be able to tell just by looking. Again, it's nice to see it looks as though it was man-made rather than by machine. Everything is slightly imperfect, with a continuation of the inside tree pattern. Usually a corner as it would be cut. Another detail I noticed was this axe just slightly covered by a splintering section of the wood. Honestly, for a moment I thought it was a glitch. I thought the axe was just clipping through it, but I'm guessing the implication is that someone was working on it and left it wedged in there lightly. Outside of general textures looking pretty tasty, there are unique design choices made, which you may or may not notice, but nonetheless add to the immersiveness as you notice it passively. An example of this would be when you're walking through the church/altar part in the opening. You can get right in there and inspect the wear and tear of the building's interior, with stains, chips, slight rotting and worn away stone. There are small collections of water, presumably carried in by people, or perhaps rain leaking through. Gatherings of straw lay around, this along with appropriate shadows, wood and stone textures, as well as general assets uniquely placed within the building, with everything being slightly imperfect, creates something pretty close to reality. Another small detail as we exit the door frame, we can see that it is slightly worn away as the doors have been opened and closed repeatedly, in addition to the outer part sticking out, which is more exposed to the elements, causing a darker outer rim. This is something most players wouldn't even notice, yet it is still there. Some of the trees look unique enough and warped like actual trees, but you just have to look up to see that some of the smaller branches, which are a little too smooth, straight, and come to a complete point, although you would really have to look for that to bother you. The way the game looks is fairly consistent throughout. Again, it seems to be sort of a repeat of assets, for example, buckets of water, barrels, stone textures, etc. The game doesn't get better or worse in this respect. It just kind of carries on what it's been doing since the beginning, as you become accustomed to the aesthetic. The setting for the game is France during the Plague, with the Inquisition storyline running parallel, while also providing us with an alternative fantasy version of history. This is a good setting for this scary, horror, disgust type experience, and it does it fairly effectively. There are parts of the game I was genuinely shocked by, but I suppose everyone has their own personal amount of too much. Sound and music play a huge role in the atmosphere, and there will be a separate section for that, so I'll try and focus on everything else. The game is brutal in parts. Chapter 9 in particular comes to mind. There are bodies littered in the streets, corpses hanging from chains, flecks of flesh on skeletons lay around. During one instance of this, we can overhear a dispute between a guard and the bourgeois. Supposedly his son was killed for the purpose of discipline. Overhearing this, while having a visual reference to it, is quite disturbing. A little later in chapter 9, we climb over a wall to discover a whole street littered with corpses of the sick. They have been slaughtered, complete with swords and spears left embedded in them. We're led to believe that the rats were used against them, supported by the fact that we can obtain tools that manipulate the rats to our own whim. Respectively, in the opening few scenes of the game, there is a very positive and friendly atmosphere within the confines of the Castle de Rune. I mentioned this before, but the particle effects for the fireplace and rising embers along with the flickering give a warm and pleasant feel to the environment, provided with the casual small talk amongst the servants. The same is carried through into the kitchen. Once again, the homey fireplace along with the slight sounds of boiling from the pot project a positive energy, which we won't be seeing much of. There seems to be a way in which the game differentiates between tones while utilising the same thing. So when the game wants to project a sense of safety and warmth, the room is very reflective of light and splays out all over, whereas when it wants to convey a sense of despair, loneliness, fear, claustrophobia, and generally negative vibes, it creates a deep contrast. Most of the area is blackened while we're the only visible thing, or focal point. This helps create an illusion of isolation and being utterly surrounded. This is also reflected in the rats. They are almost jet black with only their small, bright, piercing eyes glowing as they scurry around. This might seem super obvious to some people, but hopefully this explains why players might feel a certain way in specific parts of the game. I think this was an intentional choice made by the creators, and it works very well at provoking those respective responses. Later in the game, we're treated to some wholesome moments after escaping the rats in Chapter 3. Hugo runs off to the bubbles near the water's edge, inquiring as to what it could be. I then noticed a bloody hand mark, as well as accompanying blood on the ground. Despite everything going on with regard to the music and the dialogue, I felt uneasy on my first playthrough. We later come across a blood-soaked rag with bloody handprints, a few collectible items, an open book, a coiled rope, and some kind of bag, alongside a smouldering fire, and it allows the mind to wander as to who or what was previously here. As we progress along the path, we come across the remains of a soldier with his innards splayed out in front of him. I didn't notice this on my first playthrough, but you're able to take more than one approach in this stealth section. I've mentioned this before, but in this instance, I decided to go down what some might consider the unconventional route, since it seems more awkward and difficult to get through. The way I justify that statement is there are objectively more enemies, seemingly less cover, and the fact that you can't kill enemies as easily, or distract them. Less hanging metal to throw stones at, etc. As I make my way towards my goal, I notice a small entrance to the back of a building. I sent Hugo inside, climbed through the now open window, and immediately noticed the bloody knife that knocked over a chair with more blood. If someone has noticed an explanation for this, I'd love to hear it, but first time playing it, it sets off questions. Who was the person that was killed? Why? Where is the body? After evading a few enemies and witnessing a carriage and screams from a guard saying, following the blow of a horn, we don't know why at this point, but it allows the mind to wander as to what they're fleeing from. We're shown an entire field with piles and piles of pig carcasses, with blood and mud mixed together in a squishy soup, which often slows us down. It is later mentioned in dialogue that pigs were placed there in an attempt to relegate the rats to one small area. After escaping the pig-infested landmass, we finally arrive at Laurentius's farm. A little exploration will tell us that there is a horse skeleton in the barn, along with a large pool of blood, implying the rats at some point broke in. We then see a horse and carriage next to the main house, alongside a pigsty with an alive pig. It's almost a form of foreshadowing in the pig field, since we will need to use the alive pig to distract the rats later on. Also, did anyone else notice the back exit door? It's just a door asset placed over a stone wall. There's nothing behind it. Not a major complaint since hardly anyone would see it, although not far from it is a flower collectible, so they clearly anticipated players going around near the back of the house. I don't know, maybe it's just a spare door that's there for some reason. Upon entering the main house, we begin to hear the faint coughs of a presumably old man.
Someone's there.
Let's go and see.
After exploring upstairs, we see a teenage boy at his bedside. An old, pale, and sickly man with a scraggly beard and a fabric cap. Boils have taken place on the left side of his face, with potentially more all over his body. It has been implied thus far that the Inquisition want Hugo alive, for some purpose. Here, we hear for the first time that ancient evil, which is said to run in the de Rune family bloodline. After saying this, Laurentius appears to hold back some information. He pauses for a moment, implying that there is more that he will not explain.
An evil. An ancient evil courses through your family's veins, in its blood. Your mother and I attempted to slow its progress.
Moving on to the next point, that being that he had attempted, along with Hugo's mother, to cure or at least slow down the process, with the outbreak making it more difficult, given that this has increased its speed of progression. There appears to be some connection between the rat / the plague and Hugo, although it's not fully explained at this moment, which in itself is a little disturbing given what we know. After the rats break through into the house, we must leave to grab the ignifer, which we'll use to avoid the rats. However, it is in the barn, under a hatch, and this shit annoys me. Joseph Anderson mentioned this in his video, but it seems annoying that there is only one way to progress. Although in reality there are multiple ways in which to deal with this. You have to use the live pig to distract the rats to achieve your goal. I wanted to kill the pig beforehand so it didn't suffer as much, especially after hearing what I thought was an implication of that being entirely possible, with Lucas saying, they need meat, dead or alive. I wanted to either slit its throat or use the sling for a headshot, something we've been shown to work, but the game refuses this mercy. Why? This is the most forced, shock-inducing moment of gameplay I've seen. This is very opinionated, echoing back to what I said earlier about acknowledging when I'm expressing one, but I don't think I'm alone in thinking this. It's a shame because there are moments later in which you can show mercy, like when you use the ignifer to provide a light source for this guard. The reason I'm mentioning all this is because this...
I'm sorry, Hugo. We have no choice, Hugo. We have to get the rats away.
along with the suspenseful music and build-up, is all an attempt to make us feel a certain way. I just think they could have done a better job at making it clear that this was the only way, or alternatively allowing us to kill the pig in a more merciful way.
There was no other way.
And then they try and shame us for what we've done.
Poor pig.
It's like, mate, every player wanted to do something different. It kind of reminds me of those Last of Us 2 memes. Like, you do all this horrific crap, essentially playing the game, and then it's all like...
But why? Why would you do that? Why would you do any of that?
Not that any of it would really matter anyway. Whether you show mercy to these people or not, nothing changes. You get a slightly different line from the accompanying character, but it doesn't affect the game in the long run. So maybe it's fine that you can't kill the pig beforehand. Whatever, next section. Okay, on to sound. This will cover everything and anything audible. I was going to do separate sections for diegetic versus non-diegetic, but I'm not sure that's necessary since all sound here is in aid of immersing the player and enhancing the experience. So let's talk about it. There's nothing in particular about the sound that makes it special or bad. There are a couple of occasions in which it works very well at making the environment feel more diverse, and as if you have a real influence on the world around you. Examples of this would be through the changes of sound made from footsteps, depending on which surface you're on. You'll get a lovely squishy sound when you're walking on muddy surfaces, even more so on deeper, marshier areas. Walking on grass has a nice scratchy sound, and concrete hard floors correspond to appropriate sounds. For example, wood will have an accompanying creaky or hollow sound. While stone or more solid surfaces have a more clicky sound. Now I mentioned that there are occasionally invisible walls and other restrictions placed on the player to guide them, but when it's as heavily scripted as what I'm about to show you, it's a bit off. As you approach the aqueduct, there is a musical build-up implying something dramatic or significant is to follow once you reach the top of the hill. Every time I'm stopping in this clip, that's me trying to walk backwards or turn around. However, it won't let me because that would compromise the build-up and tension, because the music would need to die back down only to build back up again.
Oh my god.
Are they all dead?
We can't carry on.
Amicia, we have to follow the aqueduct.
Once you've seen the sprawling landmass of rotting corpses and the music has died down, you'll be able to walk back down where you came from, no problem. This is such a bizarre way of controlling the player. Now you may be asking, Tom, why are you being so awkward? Why would you need to go back when the music is indicating what you're supposed to do? And my answer to that would be, yes, I am being awkward and nitpicky. Can't argue with the observation though. I know the game likes its in-game reveals, but if they're going to do this, why not just do a very short cutscene, or move the character into position automatically? I would have objected less to that in this instance. Weird thing to complain about, but whatever. Another instance of a shock reveal is done much better in the intro. As we pursue the injured boar, we gradually find ourselves entering a more decrepit, dark and dingy environment. As such, the music changes suit this, with a standard, suspenseful few notes. However, once we get within the cutscene proximity of the corpse, we find there is a musical sting to punctuate the shock. This is much more effective since it relies on our free movement and is much more subtle. Something I did notice, which added some suspense to the experience of stealth gameplay, was the subtle breathing when near an enemy. I don't know, it seems to help put you in their shoes in the most simplistic sense of that's what you would be doing in real life. We'll cover the rats in a later segment, but I wanted to mention the shrieks of the rats. I liked it. That's it really. There's definitely moments in-game where you feel completely surrounded, especially when wearing headphones, when most of your audible noise is scattering shrieks and munching of corpses.
You can come back now. I have to get out of here. Thank you, Lucas. Keep talking to me.
I don't know what to say.
Punctuated by the haunting soundtrack, you have a very effective set piece. So more on that later. Now about the soundtrack, it's pretty great. I'm not really sure what else I can say or do to convey this besides making you listen.
Look! We found it! The castle!
Whoa. It really exists. Chateau d'Ambrage. It's amazing.
I had a moment of doubt, but that...
But it really does significantly enhance the experience at moments. One particular memorable moment was when you had to strategically use the lightning strikes to get past the rats. Something I often do, and have done for edits or playthroughs of this game, is focus solely on one thing to see if it stands on its own. I'll mute all tracks or alternatively leave the sound limited in some way and focus entirely on the visual component. I will then do the reverse, simply listening to the tracks without getting any visual input. What this allows you to do is pick up on things you wouldn't otherwise notice, were you to observe with all aspects. For any edit, this just allows you to catch any small blemishes within the content, but in playing the game without the score, you really get to see how the atmosphere stands on its own, and also just generally the sound design. And this game does very well without it. Sneaking around with the sound of heavy breathing when near an enemy, or the shrieking of rats in tight spaces, with only a single torch to keep you safe, has the same terrifying effect. The music only enhances it, which is exactly what it should do. It's really refreshing to see something which can have really effective scenes when it lacks music telling you how to feel in a particular moment. To demonstrate this, I'm going to play this scene without music.
Brother Morel. Stay here. Brother Morel. Brother?
What is the matter? Father?
No.
No! Quick! The light!
Father, no!
The light!
The music plays a part in simply enhancing something which is still fundamentally present. Through the world building of letting us in on the information about the rats in the dark, bites, the general fear of the church area, all culminating in the reveal of a significant component of the game, both mechanically and narratively. Anyone who's seen the 2004 Van Helsing film knows what I mean when I say that music can seriously elevate something. Like, I kind of have fun watching that film because it is just a bit of a mess. But the score... And I'm afraid that's all we have time for, folks. Next time we'll be going over animations, AI and more. Also, the third part will be the last part in this little series, so that's something to look forward to. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.